Hey, hello everybody. Today we're going to try something a little bit different. This is going to be a video blog, and I thought this week we'd go over the flu vaccine. We've gotten a lot of questions about it because, as you've probably all seen in the media, it wasn't quite as effective this year as it usually is. So we're talking about the flu vaccine, and specifically the 2014-2015 flu vaccine, and why it wasn't as effective this year as it usually is. It's effective. We need to know a little bit about the virus. So as they say, know your enemy. We're in a battle against the flu, and we want to know the flu virus and understand that a little bit. And then the other thing is you have to understand the weapons you have to fight the enemy. So in this case, the only weapon we really have is the flu vaccine, and we have to go over a little bit about that and how they make it, and why it works and why it doesn't work sometimes too. So let's go over the flu virus first. As most people know, there's two main types of flu virus, type A and type B. These are what we usually call the seasonal flu viruses, and that's because they tend to occur more in the wintertime and less in the warmer months of the year. So in the northern hemisphere, you'll see it in the months of November through February or so, and in the southern hemisphere, you tend to see it more, in June through September, say. There's also a third type of flu virus that infects human beings, type C influenza. You don't hear about this one quite as much because it's present all year round. It doesn't really cause epidemics. The illness tends to be less severe, and you see it more in children, not so much in adults. So one of the reasons that the influenza vaccine doesn't work quite as well as, say, the measles vaccine or the mumps vaccine is that the influenza virus tends to mutate more than those viruses do. It's sort of a random process, but it occurs pretty regularly. And what happens is there are small changes in the RNA molecules that make up the genetic information in the influenza virus, and those changes accumulate over time and cause changes in the enzymes and proteins that the virus makes, and as a result of that, the vaccines that we use in one year may not necessarily work on the virus that comes around the next year. This process of slow accumulation of genetic changes is called genetic drift, and that can happen with both type B and type A influenza. Type A influenza can undergo a different type of genetic change, though, and this happens when you have two different strains of type A influenza that infect the same animal cell, whether it's a human or a bird or a pig cell, and when those two viruses infect the same cell, the genetic material gets combined in there, and the viruses that then emerge from that cell when it reproduces are a new strain that can be different by as much as 50% in their genetic makeup. This type of rapid change is called genetic shift, but that only happens, as I said, with type A influenza. You don't see it as much with type B. So if you looked at this on a graph over time where genetic change was on the y-axis and time being on the x-axis, you'd see that there would be intervals of genetic drift interspersed with dramatic changes when genetic shift occurs, and then other intervals where genetic drift was occurring. And this plays a big role, as I said, in why the vaccine has to be changed from year to year, and why one vaccine may not be as effective as another one, depending on when these changes occur. So let's first look at how vaccines work so we can understand this a little bit better. Again, the influenza virus is an RNA virus. Its genetic material is stored as RNA, and those RNA genes code for proteins that are expressed on the surface of the virus. These proteins are different from the proteins that we have on our cells, and that's one way that our immune system recognizes a foreign invader. It looks for proteins all the time. If it sees a protein it doesn't recognize, then it says, hey, that doesn't belong here. And it'll start to signal the immune system to form antibodies that attack that particular protein. But that process can take up to 2 weeks to complete. So when we create a vaccine, what we're trying to do is shortcut that process a little bit. And what you do is you break up the virus into its individual components. You kill the virus so that it can't cause an infection, and that's what you inject into the body. The immune system recognizes those proteins just as it would if it were a real virus and forms antibodies over the course of the same 2-week period. Then if the real virus invades later on, you've got those antibodies already there, you're ready to fight the virus, and it doesn't take 2 weeks to call in the troops so that you can fight off the infection. And this way you don't get infected. The reason the flu vaccine doesn't always work is that those mutations that we talked about can occur over time. And when the genetic material changes, the proteins that they code for on the surface of the virus also change sometimes. And then the antibody, which is supposed to work like a lock and key, the way it fits to the protein, can't attach to those proteins and can't call in the immune system to attack that virus. So the body has to re-engineer itself, produce some new antibodies that fit the new protein, but again, that can take a couple of weeks. So how do we decide what strains of the virus should go in the flu vaccine? How is the flu vaccine made? The way we do that is that there are approximately 141 national influenza centers scattered around the world. And those are in approximately 111 different countries. And there are 5 World Health Organization collaborative centers also scattered around the world. They're in Atlanta, Georgia. There's another one in Melbourne, Australia, one in London, England, one in Tokyo, Japan, and one in Beijing, China. And then all those individual national influenza centers report their information into the 5 World Health Organization collaborative centers where the information is collected and then forwarded on to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization then reviews that information, and in approximately February of each year, they come out with recommendations as to which strains are most likely to be the prominent ones in the coming flu season. That'll vary, of course, depending on the hemisphere you're talking about, but they feed that information then to the individual countries, and those countries then determine which vaccine they're going to license for use in their country that year. In our country, the FDA is the organization that makes that decision. They then pass that information on to the vaccine manufacturers, and the vaccine manufacturers then go into the process of formulating, producing, and testing the vaccine for the coming year, which takes a little while to do. They then give the vaccine to the physicians in hospitals and other clinics where the vaccine is given out to patients. So to put this on a timeline, if we looked at the entire year, over the course of the year, surveillance occurs 365 days. That's the collecting of the information to determine what viruses are out there. The FDA then announces their recommendation in February. And then after that, the manufacturers go into the process of manufacturing and testing the vaccine, and then the healthcare providers give the vaccine out to the public. One problem that you can see very quickly after we've already discussed that this virus does mutate over time is that there's a 6-month lag between the time the FDA makes their recommendation and the time that the vaccine is actually delivered to providers. What's even more of a problem is that there is an 8 to 10 month lag between when the vaccine is formulated and when the peak flu season hits. So that gives the virus some opportunity to change. Now, most years that's not a problem and we usually get an effective vaccine, but if the virus happens to mutate significantly during that interval, you may find that many people get a form of the virus that the vaccine won't protect against. So what happened this year? The flu vaccine, if it's the trivalent version, has 2 strains of type A that it protects against and 1 strain of type B. There's another vaccine, the quadrivalent vaccine, and that protects also against 2 strains of type A influenza, but in addition to that, it protects against 2 strains of type B influenza as well. The vaccine is usually formulated to protect against, as I said, 2 different strains of type A influenza, and the strains that are put in there varies from year to year. The past couple of years, the strains that have been in the vaccine have been the H1N1 and H3N2. Those terms refer to proteins that are on the surface of the influenza virus. There are many different kinds of proteins, but this refers to 2 specific families, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase proteins. And those come in a number of varieties. The hemagglutinin one, there are 18 different varieties, and the neuraminidase, there are 11 different varieties. That gives you a total of 198 different combinations. Luckily, most of those viruses, H10N5 and so forth, all of them, usually only infect birds and other animals. There's only a handful that affect human beings. But there are many substrains, so every H3N2 is not the same. They have other proteins on their surface that can vary over time. And that's what happened this year. The H3N2 is still around, but there's a different version of it that has other proteins on the surface that the vaccine is not particularly formulated for. About 28% of the H3N2 that's in circulation this year is the one we prepared for, and the vaccine will work against those. But that leaves 72% that are mutated, and the vaccine doesn't protect particularly well against those. So what does that mean? Let's say we had 3 buildings full of people, each one with 100 people in it. The first building, we're going to have people who don't get the vaccine. The second building is a vaccine from a typical year. And the third building is this year's vaccine. So the first building where people have no protection, about 10 people out of 100 on average in a given year will get the flu. In the second building where we have a typically formulated vaccine that's got its usual efficacy, about 3 people would get the flu. 7 out of the 10 people would have been protected. The other people are all protected too, but in most cases they wouldn't have gotten infected. So only 3 people out of that building of 100 would get infected with a vaccine that matches well. This year, with 28% efficacy, we'd find that 7 people out of the 100 would have gotten infected. That's still a lot better than 0%. You'd save 3 people. And on a national scale, that's even more important. Because in a given year, millions of people catch the flu. So even if you could only reduce that by 30%, you're talking about millions or at least hundreds of thousands of people who are protected. And if some of those are people who would have been vulnerable and ended up hospitalized or in some cases even died from the flu, that's a significant savings in lives and illness, even from a vaccine that doesn't work all that well. So the last time I checked, 28% is still better than 0%. And keep in mind that the vaccine still offers protection against H1N1 and also the type B influenza. So when patients ask me, should I get vaccinated, I tell them we should look at this the way you look at any medical decision. Weigh the benefits and the risks. So getting the vaccine reduces your risk of getting the flu, maybe not as much as in a normal year, but it still reduces your risk. It also reduces the risk of you passing the flu on to other people, friends, coworkers, family. All of those people are at risk if you come home with the flu or go to work with the flu, so you're protecting them as well. And as we said, it decreases deaths and hospitalizations. On the risk side, yes, you can get a sore arm. But the sore arm doesn't hurt as much as getting the flu. And although 10 to 50% of people will get some degree of sore arm, in most cases it's very mild, usually goes away in a day or so. And if it's really bothersome, applying an ice pack or taking some Advil will usually make it go away. But very few people get significant soreness that they find to be uncomfortable. The other thing people get concerned about is fever and body aches. They've often heard that you can get flu-like symptoms from the vaccine. And while that's sort of true, it's not just the flu vaccine. People can get flu-like symptoms from any vaccine, whether it's tetanus, measles, mumps, the flu. It's no more likely with the influenza vaccine. It's just that whenever we activate your immune system, an active immune system sometimes can cause a little bit of a fever and body aches. This tends to happen more in kids than adults, though. When they've done studies on this, there's no greater incidence of these side effects in patients who are given placebo than there was in people who are given the flu shot. So even when it happens, it's mild, and it's not a serious concern for adults. Finally, just to dispel one myth, you cannot get the flu from the flu vaccine. I'm fond of telling patients you're more likely to get it from a bologna sandwich if somebody happens to sneeze or cough on it, but there's nothing in the flu vaccine that can give you the flu. So although some people claim that they've gotten it from that, it's more likely they got the flu from a friend or a family member and just happened to have gotten it the same week they got the vaccine. But there's no way that you can get the flu from the vaccine itself, so that's not a real concern. Bottom line is the benefits, even in a year like this, outweigh the risks. You're protecting yourself and protecting your family and friends. So the answer is a resounding yes, get the flu vaccine.